The night air was thick with tension, the dimly lit parking lot eerily quiet. Jessica Turner, a tall black woman with a confident stride, carried her grocery bags to her car. She had no idea that 4 figures lurked in the shadows, their whispers filled with malice. They had followed her for blocks, their prejudices fueling their cruel intentions. The gang struck when she least expected it. 2 men emerged from behind a truck, blocking her path, while 2 more crept closer from behind. Jessica froze for a split second, her instincts kicking in. The ringleader, a wiry man with a tattooed neck, sneered, "What's a woman like you doing out here all alone? You lost." Jessica's heart raced, but her face remained impassive. She knew better than to show fear. The grocery bag slipped from her grip, the sound of shattered glass breaking the silence. The gang surrounded her, taunting and jeering. One of them shoved her shoulder, hard enough to test her balance. Jessica staggered slightly but quickly regained her footing. "I don't want trouble," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Trouble?" the ringleader mocked. "You walked into the wrong neighborhood, sweetheart." Jessica's grip tightened around her car keys. Her mind raced through her training as a Navy officer. Years of combat preparation and self-defense techniques surged to the forefront of her thoughts. She could handle this, but the question lingered, how far were they willing to go? Another gang member lunged forward, reaching for her arm. Jessica moved with lightning speed, twisting his wrist and sending him sprawling to the ground. The others stared in disbelief as she stood tall, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "This is your last chance to walk away," Jessica warned, her voice laced with authority. But the gang misread her confidence as arrogance, their anger boiling over. They closed in, unaware of just how dangerous their prey had become. As the gang surged toward her, Jessica dropped into a combat-ready stance. With a swift kick, she disarmed one attacker, sending his weapon clattering to the ground. Her movements were precise, her focus unshakable. Then, the sound of a siren blared in the distance, faint but growing louder. The gang hesitated, their bravado faltering. Jessica didn't flinch, keeping her eyes locked on them, waiting for their next move. They were at a crossroads, fight or flee. And as the siren's wail pierced the night, the tension reached its peak. The ringleader glanced at the approaching patrol car, then back at Jessica. His eyes narrowed with a mix of hatred and fear. "This ain't over," he spat before motioning for his crew to scatter. But Jessica wasn't about to let them walk away unscathed. What would she do next? If you were in Jessica's shoes, would you have stood your ground or tried to escape? Let us know in the comments below. Jessica stood motionless in the parking lot, her eyes trained on the retreating figures of the gang. The siren had bought her a moment of reprieve, but she knew they weren't gone for good. Their parting threat echoed in her mind, "This ain't over." The patrol car arrived moments later, its lights flashing red and blue. A young officer stepped out, his expression cautious but curious. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, scanning the area. Jessica nodded, adjusting her jacket to hide her still-clenched fists. "I'm fine now," she replied. "But there were 4 men here, trying to start trouble." The officer frowned. "Do you want to file a report?" Jessica hesitated. She didn't fear the gang, but she knew the system didn't always work in her favor. Filing a report might provoke them further, and she didn't want her Navy background to make her a target in the media. "No," she said finally, "but you might want to keep an eye on this area." The officer gave her a doubtful look but nodded. As he drove off, Jessica exhaled deeply and picked up her scattered groceries. Her hands trembled slightly as adrenaline ebbed, replaced by anger. Not just at the gang, but at the underlying issue, the racism that had emboldened them. Back at her apartment, Jessica unloaded the groceries mechanically, her mind replaying the encounter. The scars of her past whispered reminders of why she'd joined the Navy in the first place. Growing up in a predominantly white suburb, she had faced covert and overt racism. Her decision to enlist wasn't just about serving her country, it was about proving her strength in a world that doubted her. Her military training had given her more than combat skills, it had instilled resilience and strategy. Tonight, those skills had saved her. But as she sipped a glass of water, she realized the fight wasn't over. The gang wouldn't let this go, and neither would she. Jessica sat down and began to strategize. She needed to understand her enemies better, their patterns, their hangouts. This wasn't just about her safety. It was about sending a message. The next morning, Jessica visited the gym, her usual sanctuary. The familiar clang of weights and hum of treadmills provided a sense of normalcy. Her friend and sparring partner, Mike, greeted her with a grin. "You look tense. What's up?" Jessica considered brushing it off but decided otherwise. "Had a run-in with some guys last night," she said. "A gang. Racist. Violent." Mike's smile faded. "You're okay, though." "Yeah, they picked the wrong person to mess with. But I think it's far from over." Mike's jaw tightened. "You want backup? You know I've got your six." Jessica smirked. "Appreciate it, but I've got a plan." Later that day, Jessica drove through the neighborhood where the attack happened. Her sharp eyes scanned for anything out of place. She spotted a rundown bar with graffiti-covered walls, a likely hangout for the gang. Jessica parked discreetly, her instincts telling her to observe from a distance. Inside, the gang lounged at a corner table, laughing and boasting about the previous night. They had no idea Jessica was outside, watching, listening. She noted their leader's swagger, the way he commanded attention. This wasn't just a gang, it was a power play, a group driven by hate and control. Jessica clenched her fists. She wasn't just going to defend herself. She was going to dismantle them piece by piece. As she sat in her car, watching the gang, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number appeared. "We know where you live." Jessica's pulse quickened. The game had escalated. Jessica stared at the message, her breath catching in her throat. The words on the screen glared back at her. "We know where you live." The audacity of their threat sent a surge of anger through her veins, momentarily drowning out the fear. These men had gone from street harassment to stalking her personal life. Her military instincts took over. She quickly scanned her surroundings, her eyes darting to parked cars, passing pedestrians, and shadowy alleyways. She saw no one suspicious, but that didn't mean they weren't watching. Jessica's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She wasn't about to let them intimidate her. Without hesitation, she backed out of her discreet spot and drove to the nearest police precinct. Inside the precinct, the air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Jessica approached the desk, where a bored-looking officer barely glanced up from his computer. "I need to report a threat," she said, keeping her voice firm. The officer sighed, clearly unimpressed. "What kind of threat?" She placed her phone on the counter and showed him the text. His expression shifted slightly as he read it. "You know who sent this?" "I have a strong idea," Jessica replied. She briefly explained the encounter from the previous night, omitting the part where she'd taken down one of the men. "They're a gang. Racist. Violent. And now they're escalating." The officer frowned but remained skeptical. "Do you have any proof they're connected to this text?" Jessica held back her frustration. She knew how these conversations went. "No," she admitted. "But you should look into it. It's only a matter of time before they do something worse." The officer jotted down some notes and gave her a thin smile. "We'll file this and keep an eye out. In the meantime, you might want to stay somewhere else for a while." Jessica stared at him, her temper flaring. "So, your solution is for me to uproot my life while they walk free? That's not good enough." The officer didn't respond, his silence a tacit confirmation of her fears. Jessica grabbed her phone and left, her mind already working on a new plan. Back home, Jessica wasn't about to take the officer's advice. Instead, she secured her apartment. Her military training had prepared her for hostile situations, and she knew how to make her space a fortress. She checked every lock, reinforced the windows, and set up a makeshift alarm system using tripwires and small objects that would create noise if disturbed. As she worked, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. Her apartment building, taken from the street, was framed in the glow of a streetlight. The message beneath it read, "Time's ticking." Jessica's jaw tightened. She took a screenshot and forwarded it to her friend Mike with a short message. "I might need backup sooner than I thought." That evening, Jessica returned to her car and drove back to the gang's hideout. She parked far enough away to avoid suspicion and settled in to watch. The gang was gathered outside, laughing and drinking, completely unaware they were being surveilled. Jessica pulled out her camera and began taking photos, capturing their faces, their tattoos, and any identifiable details. As she zoomed in on the ringleader, She noticed something peculiar. A tattoo on his forearm, a snake wrapped around a dagger, was eerily familiar. It was a symbol she'd seen during her deployment, often associated with a notorious white supremacist group. This wasn't just a random gang. They were part of something bigger. Jessica's blood ran cold. This was no longer about a petty street gang targeting her out of boredom. These men were part of an organized hate group, and their reach might extend far beyond what she'd imagined. She was about to leave when she saw one of the men glance in her direction. Jessica quickly ducked down, her heart pounding. Did they see her? She waited, her body tense, until the gang eventually went back to their conversation. She exhaled slowly and started her car, driving away with her lights off until she was safely out of the neighborhood. As she pulled into her apartment complex, Jessica's mind raced with questions. Was she prepared for what lay ahead? Could she take on something this dangerous alone? She stepped out of her car and froze. There, taped to her apartment door, was a single white envelope. Her name was scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. Jessica's hand hovered over the envelope, debating whether to open it. She wasn't sure what she feared more, what was inside or what it meant. What do you think is inside the envelope? A warning, a threat, or something worse? Share your guesses in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you are enjoying the story. Jessica's fingers hovered over the envelope, her instincts screaming at her to proceed with caution. She glanced around, scanning the shadows for movement, but the parking lot was empty. With a deep breath, she grabbed the envelope and stepped into her apartment, locking the door behind her. She placed it on the counter, staring at it like it might explode. Whatever lay inside was meant to send a message, and it wasn't going to be good. Pulling on a pair of gloves, she carefully opened it. A single piece of paper slid out. Scrawled in crude handwriting were the words, "You're marked. We don't stop." Her stomach churned, but she kept her composure. These men wanted her to feel vulnerable, helpless. Instead, their threats fueled her determination. She folded the note and tucked it into a plastic bag. Evidence. If she was going to take them down, she needed to be methodical. The next morning, Jessica called Mike. "I need your help," she said without preamble. "Say no more," Mike replied. "When and where?" "Meet me at the old boxing gym at noon. I'll explain everything there." At the gym, Mike listened intently as Jessica laid out the situation. His expression darkened as she described the gang, the threats, and the symbol on the ringleader's arm. "This isn't just a gang," Jessica concluded. "They're part of a hate group. I saw the tattoo, same one I encountered overseas." Mike nodded grimly. "You're saying these guys are organized?" "Exactly. This isn't random. They're targeting me, but it could be anyone next." Mike clenched his fists. "So what's the plan?" "We gather evidence," Jessica said. "Photos, recordings, anything that ties them to their activities. Then we expose them. The cops might not care about one woman being harassed, but they'll have to act if we show they're part of a larger network." Mike grinned. "You've got that Navy strategic mind working overtime." "I'm in." That night, the two of them returned to the gang's hangout, this time better prepared. Jessica had a high-quality camera with a zoom lens, and Mike brought a drone equipped with a small camera. They parked far enough away to remain unnoticed and began their surveillance. The gang was in their usual spot outside the bar, but tonight they were more animated, their voices carrying snippets of their plans. Jessica's heart raced as she heard words like shipment and rally. This wasn't just a group of thugs, they were planning something bigger. Mike maneuvered the drone closer, capturing clear footage of the gang and their conversations. Jessica kept her camera trained on them, snapping photos of faces, tattoos, and anything else identifiable. Then, a black SUV pulled up, and a man in a suit stepped out. He was older, with sharp features and an air of authority. The gang instantly fell silent, their demeanor shifting to deference. Jessica's grip on the camera tightened. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a random visitor. He was someone important. The man handed the ringleader a small envelope. Jessica's camera zoomed in, capturing every detail. The ringleader opened it, and she caught a glimpse of what looked like a stack of cash. "This is the start," the man said, his voice low but firm. "Don't screw it up." The gang nodded in unison, their bravado replaced by tension. Jessica and Mike exchanged a glance. This was bigger than either of them had anticipated. As the SUV drove away, Jessica and Mike began to pack up. But as they did, one of the gang members stepped away from the group and looked directly toward their hiding spot. Jessica's blood ran cold. "Did they see us?" Mike whispered. "Not sure," Jessica replied, her voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "We need to move. Now." They quickly got into the car, driving away without turning on the headlights until they were a safe distance. Jessica's heart pounded as she reviewed the footage. They had enough to prove the gang was part of something larger, but now, the question was how to use it without putting themselves in even greater danger. As Jessica and Mike pulled into her apartment complex, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video. She opened it with a sense of dread. The grainy footage showed the gang outside her building, laughing as they spray-painted the words, "We're watching," on her door. Jessica's stomach dropped as the video ended. The gang had crossed a line. She gritted her teeth and turned to Mike, who was already watching her, his face a mask of concern. "They're trying to intimidate you," he said. "But this just proves they're scared." Jessica didn't respond. Instead, she stepped out of the car and approached her apartment cautiously. The faint smell of fresh spray paint lingered in the air. She glanced at the door, now marked with the crude graffiti, "We're watching." Her fists clenched, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't just a threat, it was bait, meant to provoke her into making a mistake. "Let's clean this up," she said, her voice cold and steady. Mike nodded. "I'll grab some supplies from my trunk." Inside, Jessica reviewed the footage they had gathered earlier. Every detail mattered: the ringleader's tattoo, the man in the suit, the exchange of money. It all pointed to something far more sinister than she'd initially suspected. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mike returned with cleaning supplies. "You know," he said as they scrubbed the door, "we can't just keep playing defense. These guys need to know they messed with the wrong person." Jessica smirked despite herself. "I like the way you think." The next day, Jessica and Mike took the footage to a trusted contact, Angela, a local journalist known for exposing corruption and hate groups. Angela watched the videos intently, her brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. "This is big," Angela said when the last clip ended. "If we can tie these guys to the broader network you're describing, it'll blow the lid off their entire operation." "But you'll need more than this." Jessica frowned. "More?" Angela nodded. "You have their faces and a possible connection to a hate group, but to take this public, we need undeniable proof, something that links them directly to their crimes and their leaders." "Like what?" Mike asked. Angela leaned back in her chair, thinking. "A manifesto, plans for an attack, anything that shows intent. If they're organized, they'll have records somewhere. Find them, and we'll have what we need." Jessica glanced at Mike, who raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like we're going hunting," he said. That evening, Jessica and Mike prepared for their next move. They decided to infiltrate the gang's hideout, an old warehouse they'd seen the gang frequent. It was risky, but they needed something solid to connect the gang to their larger network. Using their military and technical skills, they planned the operation meticulously. Mike would distract the gang with a drone, while Jessica would slip inside and search for evidence. At midnight, they arrived near the warehouse. Jessica's nerves were sharp, but her focus was sharper. Mike launched the drone, sending it buzzing toward the warehouse's entrance. As expected, the gang members outside were distracted, shouting and throwing objects at the flying intruder. Jessica moved quickly, slipping through a side door. Inside, the air was stale, the dim lighting casting long shadows. She crept through the space, her boots silent on the concrete floor. A table covered with papers caught her eye, and she quickly began snapping photos. Her heart raced as she scanned the documents. There were lists of names, addresses, and what appeared to be plans for a rally. One document stood out, a detailed map with key locations circled. This wasn't just a gang, it was a cell of a much larger network. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the other side of the warehouse. "Who's there?" Jessica froze, her mind racing. The gang had returned sooner than expected. She stuffed the documents into her jacket and began to move, staying low and in the shadows. Footsteps echoed through the space, drawing closer. She reached the side door just as one of the men spotted her. "Hey! Stop!" he shouted, lunging toward her. Jessica spun around, delivering a swift kick that sent him sprawling. Without waiting, she bolted out of the warehouse and sprinted toward the car where Mike was waiting. They sped away, the gang's shouts fading into the distance. Jessica's heart pounded as she clutched the stolen documents. They had what they needed, but the gang wouldn't let this go unanswered. Back at her apartment, Jessica spread the documents on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed them. One page caught her attention, a list of names under the heading targets. Her breath hitched when she saw her own name circled in red. Jessica stared at the list, her name circled in ominous red ink. The weight of it hit her like a punch to the gut. She had suspected the gang's reach was bigger than her, but seeing her name on a list of targets made it personal. She forced her breathing to steady. Panicking now wouldn't help. Planning would. Mike leaned over her shoulder, his face grim. They've got a list of names. This isn't just harassment. They're preparing for something serious. Jessica nodded, her mind racing. We need to figure out who else is on this list and why. If these people are in danger, we have to warn them. Her finger trailed over the list. Most of the names were unfamiliar, but a few stood out. Public figures, local activists, and community leaders were among the targets. It wasn't random. This was a calculated effort to intimidate and silence voices. The next morning, Jessica and Mike began reaching out to the names on the list. It wasn't easy. Some people were hesitant to believe them, while others were outright dismissive. But a handful of individuals thanked them for the warning and agreed to stay vigilant. Jessica also passed the list to Angela, who promised to investigate further. If I can verify this with another source, it'll blow the story wide open, Angela said. But you need to stay safe. They know you've seen this. Jessica's lips tightened. I'm not backing down. Angela sighed. I didn't think you would. That evening, Jessica returned to her apartment to find her front door ajar. Her stomach dropped, and she instinctively reached for the knife she kept concealed in her bag. She pushed the door open slowly, every nerve on edge. The place was ransacked. Drawers were overturned, furniture shoved aside, and her belongings scattered across the floor. A single word was spray-painted on the wall in dripping black letters: "Run." Jessica's jaw clenched. This was no longer a game of intimidation. It was war. She stepped back into the hallway and called Mike. They were here. They tore my place apart. Mike's voice was steady but urgent. Get out of there. We'll figure this out somewhere safe. Jessica didn't argue. She grabbed a pre-packed bag she kept for emergencies and left the apartment without looking back. She knew staying would only make her an easier target. Mike met her at a secure location, a cabin on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. It belonged to a friend of his who was out of town, and it would serve as their base of operations for the time being. Jessica sat at the dining table, going through the documents again. They're escalating, she said. They want me out of the picture because I'm getting too close. Or because they're planning something big and don't want you interfering, Mike added. Jessica nodded. Either way, we have to act fast. If they're targeting these people, it's not just about me anymore. The next day, Jessica and Mike returned to the neighborhood near the gang's warehouse. This time, their goal was to track the black SUV and its mysterious driver. Whoever he was, he held the key to exposing the larger network. Using a combination of surveillance and their military skills, they waited for hours until the SUV appeared. Jessica's pulse quickened as she spotted the man in the suit stepping out again. He spoke briefly with the gang leader before driving off. Follow him, Jessica said, starting the car. They tailed the SUV at a safe distance, careful not to be noticed. It led them to a gated estate on the outskirts of the city. The property was massive, with high fences and cameras dotting the perimeter. The man entered the estate, disappearing inside. This isn't just a gang hangout, Mike said. This is someone with serious resources. Jessica grabbed her phone and snapped photos of the property, noting key details. We'll figure out who owns this place, she said. If we can tie it to the gang, it'll be the break we need. Back at the cabin, Jessica cross-referenced the property with public records. Her suspicions were confirmed. It belonged to a wealthy businessman with ties to far-right organizations. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. But before they could celebrate, a low rumble outside made Jessica freeze. She exchanged a glance with Mike, then peered out the window. A dark car was parked on the dirt road, its headlights off. "They've found us," she whispered. The cabin's front door suddenly rattled, followed by the sound of heavy boots crunching on the gravel. Jessica grabbed her weapon and looked at Mike. "We're not running this time," she said. "Let's end this." "What would you do if you were cornered by a group of people out to silence you? Would you fight or try to escape? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to see how Jessica handles this." The boots on the gravel grew louder, crunching with deliberate menace. Jessica pressed her back against the wall, her weapon in hand, her breaths controlled and steady. Across the room, Mike crouched low, his jaw tight as he gripped his own weapon. They exchanged a glance, a silent agreement. This wasn't going to end with them giving up. The first loud bang echoed through the cabin as the gang tried to kick down the door. Jessica's training kicked in. "Move to the back," she whispered to Mike. "We funnel them where we want them." Mike nodded, retreating silently toward the kitchen. Jessica positioned herself behind the overturned couch, her ears tuned to every sound. Another kick, and the door splintered open. Flashlights swept across the room, the gang's voices low but tense. "She's here somewhere," one of them muttered. Jessica waited, her muscles coiled like a spring. The first man stepped inside, his silhouette tall and imposing. He took a step closer, and Jessica struck. In a fluid motion, she lunged forward, disarming him and sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, groaning in pain. The others reacted immediately, shouting orders and charging into the cabin. Mike emerged from the shadows, striking one with the butt of his weapon and sending him reeling. Another gang member aimed a flashlight toward Mike, but Jessica moved quickly, knocking the light from his hand and delivering a blow to his stomach. The cabin erupted into chaos. Jessica and Mike moved like a well-oiled machine, their training and teamwork outmatching the gang's brute force. One by one, the attackers fell, their confidence crumbling under the duo's relentless assault. But the gang leader wasn't among them. Jessica realized this was just the first wave, a test. Her suspicion was confirmed when the leader's voice called from outside. "Turner! I know you're in there," he shouted. "Come out now, and we'll make it quick. Keep hiding, and we'll burn this place to the ground." Jessica's blood boiled at the arrogance in his tone. "He wants us to think we're cornered," she whispered to Mike. Mike grinned despite the situation. He doesn't know who he's dealing with. Jessica peeked out a side window and saw the leader standing near the dark car, flanked by two more men. They held what looked like Molotov cocktails, ready to set the cabin ablaze. Her mind raced. She needed to act fast. "Cover me," she said to Mike, motioning toward the front door. "What's the plan?" "We take out the ringleader. Cut the head off the snake." Mike nodded and moved to the side of the room, ready to provide a distraction. Jessica grabbed a heavy piece of wood from the fireplace and slipped out through the back door, her movements silent and precise. Outside, the night was still except for the faint murmur of the gang leader's voice, taunting her. Jessica crept through the shadows, circling around to get behind him. She could hear him laughing with his men, their overconfidence blinding them to her approach. In one swift motion, Jessica struck. The piece of wood connected with the back of one man's head, sending him crumpling to the ground. Before the others could react, she disarmed the second man, knocking him unconscious with a well-placed punch. The leader spun around, his face twisted with shock and rage. "You," he started, but Jessica didn't let him finish. She stepped forward, her movements fluid and precise, and landed a kick to his chest that sent him sprawling. Mike appeared moments later, holding the gang leader at gunpoint while Jessica restrained him with zip ties. The remaining attackers, seeing their leader captured, fled into the night. Jessica's chest heaved as she surveyed the scene, her adrenaline finally beginning to subside. "You thought you could intimidate me," she said, leaning close to the gang leader. "You picked the wrong target." The man glared at her, defiance still burning in his eyes. "You think this ends here? We're everywhere." Jessica smirked. "Then I'll keep fighting everywhere." As dawn broke, Jessica and Mike handed the gang leader over to the police, along with the documents and footage they had collected. Angela met them at the station, her eyes wide with disbelief as she reviewed the evidence. "This is enough to take down the local cell," Angela said. "But if what he says is true, there's a bigger network out there." Jessica nodded. We've dealt them a blow, but this fight isn't over. As Jessica left the station, her phone buzzed. Another message. This time, it was a video. It showed a crowded room, filled with angry faces, chanting slogans. The caption read, "You're next." Jessica's grip on her phone tightened as she watched the video. The crowded room was unmistakably part of the hate group's rally. The message was clear. They weren't just retaliating, they were regrouping. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the anger and resolve settle in her chest. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about stopping something much larger. Mike placed a hand on her shoulder. "What's the play?" Jessica looked at him, her jaw set. "We take this all the way." The video gave them a crucial lead, the rally's location. Angela, working her journalist contacts, confirmed it was happening that night at an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. It was a gathering of the group's leadership, meant to galvanize their members and finalize their plans. Jessica knew it was her best chance to dismantle the organization. But she also knew it would be dangerous. "We'll need more than just us this time," she said. Jessica reached out to a trusted former Navy comrade, Marcus, who lived nearby. When she explained the situation, Marcus didn't hesitate. "Count me in. These people need to be stopped." With Marcus on board, the team prepared. They gathered equipment, body cameras to record evidence, tactical gear for protection, and tools to neutralize potential threats without lethal force. They coordinated with Angela, who agreed to be their media contact, ready to blow the story open once they returned with evidence. That night, the team parked a safe distance from the factory. They approached under the cover of darkness, using their military training to avoid detection. From a vantage point, Jessica peered into the factory through a broken window. Dozens of people were inside, including several men she recognized from the gang. At the center stood the man in the suit, his commanding presence keeping the room silent as he spoke. "This is the beginning," he declared, his voice amplified by a makeshift sound system. "No one will stop us. Not the police, not the media, and certainly not one woman." Jessica's blood boiled, but she kept her focus. She nodded to Marcus, who activated his body camera. "Let's get closer," she whispered. Inside, the group was growing rowdier, their chants echoing off the factory walls. Jessica and her team crept along the perimeter, recording everything. Then she spotted it, a table laden with documents, maps, and even weapons. This was the proof they needed. "Marcus, cover us," Jessica whispered. "Mike, with me." They moved toward the table, keeping to the shadows. As they began photographing the evidence, a voice called out, "Hey, who's there?" The room erupted into chaos. Jessica and Mike ducked behind the table as the crowd turned toward them. The man in the suit barked orders, and several men charged forward. "Time to move," Jessica shouted. Marcus created a distraction, setting off a smoke grenade that filled the factory with thick white plumes. Jessica and Mike grabbed as many documents as they could before retreating toward the exit. The group chased them into the night, but Jessica's team was prepared. Using flashbangs and other non-lethal tools, they disoriented their pursuers long enough to escape to their car. Tires screeched as they sped away, their hearts pounding but their mission successful. Back at the cabin, the team reviewed their haul. Among the documents were detailed plans for attacks on community centers, lists of targets, and connections to national and international hate groups. Angela's eyes widened as she scanned the evidence. This isn't just a local network. This could bring down an entire movement. Jessica nodded. "And it will. Let's make sure this gets to the right people." The story broke the next day, a coordinated release across multiple media outlets. The hate group's plans were exposed, and law enforcement couldn't ignore the evidence. Arrests followed, and their network began to crumble. The man in the suit was apprehended, his influence shattered. Jessica watched the news coverage, a mix of relief and pride washing over her. The fight had been long and grueling, but they had made a difference. Weeks later, Jessica sat on her apartment balcony, the graffiti scrubbed clean, her door repaired. Mike and Marcus joined her, beers in hand. "You think it's over?" Mike asked. Jessica took a sip of her drink, her gaze steady. "It's never completely over. But they'll think twice before coming after us, or anyone else again." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jessica allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She had faced hatred head-on and emerged stronger. For now, that was enough. What did you think of Jessica's journey? Would you have been as brave in her position? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with your friends.